For 30 years and more than 23,000 guests, Johnny Carson sat behind that desk and watched Hollywood walk through his curtain. Most interviews faded into television history. A handful never did. One star waited 29 years before finally sitting down with him. Another appeared so often the number sounds impossible. One night, two comedy legends nearly came to blows live on air, and everyone watching could feel it. These are the guests Johnny Carson's own show turned into legend, moments so unusual, so charged, or so quietly devastating that decades later, people still talk about them. And the first name on the list was actor number 1, Bert Reynolds. Some actors visited The Tonight Show. Bert Reynolds practically lived there. Across the decades Johnny Carson ruled late night, Reynolds is believed to have sat in that guest chair an astonishing 61 times, making him possibly the single most frequent guest in the show's entire 30-year history. It wasn't a coincidence, and it wasn't just publicity. The relationship began building in the early 1970s, right as Reynolds transformed from a working character actor into the biggest box office star in America. Deliverance hit in 1972. The Longest Yard followed in 1974. Then came Smokey and the Bandit in 1977, and Reynolds was for a few years simply the most bankable man in Hollywood. Every time his star rose another notch, he found his way back to Carson's couch, not because a publicist booked another press stop, but because the two men genuinely liked each other's company. Carson clearly trusted him too. Reynolds guest hosted the show himself on numerous occasions, something Carson extended to only a select circle of friends. Their rapport had an easy, needling quality. Reynolds could tease Carson, and Carson could tease right back, without either man missing a beat. It wasn't always pure comfort, either. In one 1985 appearance, Reynolds used his time on the couch to go on a pointed tirade about a journalist who'd betrayed his trust after being invited onto a film set, a rare moment where the usually smooth-leading man let real frustration show through on national television. By the time Reynolds made his final appearance on the show in March 1992, just months before Carson himself signed off for good, the two men had built one of the longest-running relationships in Tonight Show history. Reynolds famously went out in style. But if volume made Reynolds memorable, the next guest earned his spot for something else entirely, a night where the couch itself seemed to catch fire. Actor number 2, Chevy Chase. Not every unforgettable Tonight Show moment came from warmth. Some came from tension so thick the studio audience could feel it. On May 4, 1977, Johnny Carson found himself refereeing one of the most uncomfortable exchanges his desk ever witnessed, and it happened because Chevy Chase couldn't sit still. Chase, fresh off his star-making run on Saturday Night Live, had come on to promote his own comedy special. So had the guest sharing his couch that night, Richard Pryor. The two had a complicated history dating back to Chase's arrival on SNL, and it showed immediately. When Pryor launched into a story about his own upcoming special, describing a taping crowded with black attendees and joking about how few white attendees showed up, Chase kept leaning into frame, cutting the punchline off before Pryor could land it. It escalated fast. Chase needled Pryor about rumors that he was being groomed to eventually take over the Tonight Show chair. "I knew you were going to bring that up," Chase shot back when Pryor turned the joke around on him. The audience, sensing the exchange had stopped being an act, went quiet. Carson, ever the veteran, stepped in to defuse it. "You guys better be big hits tomorrow night," he warned both men before cutting to commercial. It didn't fully cool off. Later in the same segment, Carson asked Pryor point-blank whether he'd seen Chase's special. Pryor didn't hesitate. "I don't like Chevy," he said flatly, leaving Carson to awkwardly cut away again. It wasn't the only friction of the night. Carson had asked Chase to demonstrate the pratfall that made him famous on SNL, and even that bit went sideways when Chase tripped for real on his way back to his seat. Years later, Carson himself would needle Chase publicly too, reportedly cracking that Chase couldn't ad-lib a fart after a baked bean dinner after rumors swirled that Chase might succeed him. It's one thing to watch two comedians spar for laughs. It's another to watch two guests forget the cameras are rolling, and the man across the desk was the only reason the whole thing didn't fully derail. But Richard Pryor's own history with Carson's show ran far deeper than one tense night with Chevy Chase. Actor number 3, Richard Pryor. Long before the Chevy Chase standoff, Richard Pryor had already built a Tonight Show history all his own, one defined less by conflict and more by moments of surprising candor that Carson, more than almost any other host, knew how to draw out of him. Pryor's first appearance dated back to July 1968, when he was still an emerging stand-up finding his voice. Over the years that followed, he became one of Carson's most anticipated bookings, a comedian friend Carson genuinely admired and rarely got to see, since Pryor's visits to the couch were relatively infrequent given his stature. Their conversations often had an easy warmth, trading stories about mutual friends, reminiscing about a wedding reception Pryor had once attended at Carson's own house. One of the more unexpected moments came in 1978, when Pryor, after finishing his own segment, simply stayed on set and spent nearly 20 minutes deep in conversation, sometimes outright debate, with fellow guest Dorothy Fooldame, an 85-year-old pioneering journalist. It wasn't a bit. It was two generations of very different public figures genuinely talking, and Carson let it run. By 1983, the tone shifted. Pryor sat across from Carson and openly discussed rumors that had spread after his ex-wife's comments were misconstrued in the press, and he spoke candidly about years of struggling with drinking before choosing to step away from it, recalling, in one moment that had Carson doubled over laughing, a bartender shouting that the bar had run dry. In 1986, following his widely publicized health struggles and dramatic weight loss, Pryor sat with Carson again and addressed the rumors head-on, reassuring the audience directly that he didn't have one of those diseases. What made Pryor different from almost every other guest on this list wasn't spectacle. It was honesty. Carson gave him room to be funny and room to be serious, sometimes in the same breath, and Pryor used both. If Pryor's history with the show ran deep, the next guest's connection to Carson broke new ground in a completely different way. Actor number 4, Sammy Davis Jr. Long before he became one of Carson's most beloved recurring guests, Sammy Davis Jr. made history simply by sitting in the host's chair. In April 1965, Davis guest-hosted The Tonight Show, becoming the first African-American to host a late-night talk show on American television. He wasn't a one-time novelty either. Davis returned to guest host multiple times through the mid-1960s, at a moment when that kind of platform for a black entertainer was still exceptionally rare. His chemistry with Carson only grew from there. Davis appeared again and again over the following decades, performing, trading impressions, sparring good-naturedly, becoming one of the show's most reliably electric guests. Their rapport was so well known across the industry that it directly led to one of the most famous unscripted moments in all of television. In 1972, Davis appeared as a guest star on All in the Family, playing a version of himself who ends up in Archie Bunker's living room. At the end of the scene, on a count of 3, Davis leaned in and kissed the stunned, bigoted Archie squarely on the cheek, a moment that brought down the house and is still remembered as one of the biggest laughs in sitcom history. According to the episode's director, that entire storyline existed because Davis had mentioned, during one of his Tonight Show appearances, that he'd love to guest on the series. Carson's couch didn't just showcase Davis's talent, it quietly set another piece of television history in motion. Davis kept coming back to Carson's show for years afterward, performing standards, trading playful barbs, and appearing alongside stars like Bette Davis and Bert Reynolds on the same bill. For a performer who broke barriers everywhere he went, The Tonight Show was one of the stages where he did it most visibly, first from a host's chair, and then for decades from the guest seat right beside Johnny. The next guest on this list needed no history to make her mark. One appearance was all it took. Actor number 5, Carrie Fisher. By 1983, Carrie Fisher didn't need much of an introduction. She'd already played Princess Leia twice, and audiences everywhere knew her face. But she had never once sat across from Johnny Carson, and when she finally did, the appearance became an instant, oft-replayed classic almost by accident. Carson, introducing her for the first time, found himself unexpectedly tongue-tied, stumbling over his own words during the monologue leading up to her entrance, a stumble that, once it started, seemed to spread through the rest of the segment like a contagious laugh. Fisher walked out smiling, clearly delighted rather than rattled by the gaffe, and the two spent much of the interview simply laughing at each other's mistakes. At one point, Carson brought up how difficult the dense science fiction dialogue from the Star Wars films must have been to memorize. Fisher, without missing a beat, launched into a note-perfect recitation of one of Leia's most notoriously clunky lines, something about placing vital information into the memory systems of an astromech droid, daring Carson to try repeating it back. He couldn't get through it cleanly, broke into laughter, and Fisher leaned her head back and laughed right along with him. It wasn't a rehearsed bit. It was two quick, sharp people genuinely entertaining each other in real time. Fisher would return to the show several more times over the following years, but that first 1983 appearance became the one clip fans kept coming back to, not because of a scripted joke, but because of exactly the kind of unscripted chemistry Carson's show was built to capture. For a franchise still finding its footing in Hollywood's mainstream, that appearance helped cement Fisher not just as Princess Leia, but as one of the wittiest guests to ever sit in that chair. If Fisher's spotlight moment was pure comic chemistry, the next name on this list carried something far heavier behind the smile, a family legacy that stretched straight back to one of Carson's most unforgettable nights. Actor number 6, Liza Minnelli. Liza Minnelli's history with The Tonight Show began early. Her first appearances date back to the mid-1960s when she was still emerging from the enormous shadow of her mother, Judy Garland. Over the following 2 decades, Minnelli became one of the show's most frequent musical guests, performing signature numbers like Cabaret and New York, New York, live for Carson's audience on multiple occasions well into the 1980s. Carson had known her since she was essentially a child, and that familiarity gave their on-air conversations an easy, almost family-like warmth other guests couldn't quite replicate. She wasn't simply promoting a film or an album when she showed up. She was, in a sense, Hollywood royalty returning to a stage her own mother had once dominated. And that connection ran deeper than most viewers realized. Judy Garland's very last surviving television appearance had happened on this same show, in this same studio, sitting across from this same host. When Liza took her place in that chair years later, performing the songs that built her own legendary career, she was standing, knowingly or not, in the exact spot where her mother's public story had effectively closed. Minnelli's own Tonight Show history became its own kind of chronicle, a performer returning again and again across the 60s, 70s, and 80s, growing from Broadway's brightest new voice into an EGOT-level star in her own right, all while Carson watched from the same desk. It's one of the rare threads on this list that connects 2 entries directly, because the story of Liza Minnelli on this show cannot be fully separated from the story that came just before hers chronologically and comes right after it here. Which brings us to the guest whose final television appearance, right there in Carson's chair, became something far more than just another interview. Actor number 7, Judy Garland. Judy Garland's history with The Tonight Show carries a weight unlike almost anything else in Carson's 30-year run, because one of her appearances there turned out to be the last time she was ever captured on television at all. Garland first appeared with Carson on June 24, 1968. Carson, introducing her, called her a performer who brought audiences to a higher emotional pitch than anyone else he'd hosted. The appearance became legendary in its own right for the audience's reaction alone. When Garland walked out, the applause and screaming ran so long that she and Carson simply stood there together for over a minute, unable to continue, both visibly amused by it. "I didn't get that kind of reaction when I was born," Carson joked once things finally settled. In that first visit, Garland spoke about her upcoming concert engagement at the Garden State Arts Center, joked about wanting to be rich enough to sing whenever she pleased, and reflected warmly on her favorite co-stars, insisting she'd never once fought with any of them. She returned that December, on December 17, 1968, for what became her final surviving television appearance. Only her segment of that broadcast still exists today. The rest of the episode is lost. On it, she sang "It's All For You," until after the holidays, 2 songs written specifically for her by John Mayer. Less than a year later, in June 1969, Garland died in London. Watching that December footage decades later, knowing what came after, gives the performance an entirely different weight than it carried in the moment. It wasn't billed as a farewell. Nobody watching that night knew it would become one. But it endures today as the last documented glimpse television audiences ever got of one of the 20th century's most towering talents, captured, almost by chance, in Johnny Carson's studio. If Garland's story closes on an ending nobody saw coming, the final guest on this list closes it on the opposite note, a beginning that took 29 years to finally arrive. Actor number 8, Elizabeth Taylor. In 30 years of hosting The Tonight Show and interviewing more than 23,000 guests, Johnny Carson tried for nearly 3 decades to get one particular star to sit in his chair. Elizabeth Taylor said no every single time, until, with only months left before Carson's own retirement, she finally said yes. The appearance aired February 21, 1992, less than a week before Taylor's 60th birthday and roughly 3.5 months before Carson stepped away from the show for good. Carson didn't waste the moment. 3.5 months to go, and we finally got you here, he told her, delighted, reminding the audience he'd been trying since practically the beginning of his tenure. Taylor explained simply that she'd always been too nervous to do it. This time, she said, she wasn't there to promote anything. "I have nothing to sell. I just wanted to thank you for 30 years of brilliant entertainment." What followed became one of the most quietly powerful conversations Carson ever had on that couch. Asked about the secret to her extraordinary longevity in an industry that chews up most careers, Taylor didn't offer a rehearsed line. "Perhaps it's because I am a survivor," she said, "and I'm like a living example of what people can go through and survive." She spoke candidly about having been near death more than once. Carson asked her directly about a moment in London when she had actually been declared dead, and about reading her own obituaries, which she joked with real Taylor wit turned out to be some of the best reviews of her career. Fellow guest Michael Douglas, sharing the couch that same night, admitted he'd been just as intimidated the first time he met Carson back in 1971. But the night belonged to Taylor. One writer, later reflecting on Carson's entire three-decade run, singled this appearance out specifically, calling it one of the sweetest moments of the whole series, the night Elizabeth Taylor turned Johnny into her straight man. It took 29 years, one single conversation, and a shared understanding that time was almost up for both of them. In the end, it was worth the wait.